We're now going to go in and refine the rows in the material, add some bump to it, and make it look a little more realistic, and get rid of those kind of weird crop lines we've got right now that are really just a bump for the separator, the separations between the rows, which are also spaced out poorly. It's a little too uniform. Really, the rows and the in-between portions should be a lot smaller. So right now we'll just go into the material. I'm going to go into the Farmland color. And what I want is a nice bump I can use. We're just going to set up a fractal. And I'm going to pay more attention right now to the render output. And go ahead and add in a fractal, and let's just do a simple fractal and connect our bump to it. I'm probably going to need a higher output, so we'll go into the bump channel and set it to 1. And maybe we'll go a little higher than that. We'll just bring it up to 2. And then go back into the function. And we can use different noises to simulate different types of plants, different crops. But for now, I'm just going to stick with this very basic simple fractal, which is just Perlin noise gradient. And what I want is that the rows don't have the bump, so we're going to use that row. And there is a couple of ways we can mix this. I'm going to go to the blender, just add a combiner node blender, and I'm going to use that filter with a map node on it. And the default values, where we have an input of -1, upper 1 for the lower and the upper, output 0 to 1, which is going to give us what we want for a multiplier, at least it should. Input 0 on the fractal, input 1 on the filter, connect our bump. And let's see what happens if we connect to max. Not quite. Minimum is still being cut off too much, so let's just multiply. Should get a value of 0 along this edge. Now I'm not big on the rows the way they're set up, so I'm going to decrease the gap. And I don't like that harsh edge. So I'm gonna try to just pull it down just a little. And just bring that in a little. Just trying to adjust that harsh bump we've got caused here. But right now what I want to do is multiply basically the center of the row by 0 so that there's virtually no bump. And we can go back to that fractal, maybe increase the roughness a little. Let's see how that looks. And that looks better farther away. The close-up still, for the main part, is just too large. that sort of separation. If I was to do the more even lines, I would make a little bigger for the multiplier just to make a color change. But what I want to do is go back and let's make those lines a little smaller. Because in comparison to the scale of the trees, they're just too big. And then the dirt road could probably use a little bit of a bump as well. But what I want to show you now, I'm not going to spend too much time tweaking this, is I had mentioned before about randomizing the function. So let's say we go into Randomize, and it doesn't look like it's really having much of an impact on the position. That's probably because of the scale. Let's see what kind of numbers we're getting. Let's go in here and see where it added the randomize. And it did it before everything. And I'm not sure I actually want that on the entire function. So I think what I'm going to do is just delete that. Let's get it back to where we were. And I'm just going to manually adjust it to randomize just the clumps. So we'll add in math, randomness, vector 3 seed. And now we should be able to just adjust the clumps. And because of the scale of this, it really doesn't appear to be creating a very big vector. So since it's not really moving around a lot, it would be something we would go in and we can just enter in manual seed values. Now, if we want this to reflect in the other layers, then we also need to copy this. And it looks like we might be missing something. Looks like the rows are no longer connected. There we go. So now the rows are back because that multiply came undone when I deleted the seed. So what we can do is just copy this seed, click OK, and then we can go into anything else that is using that control and just add that in between the position, also into the alpha. And now they'll match back up. And now it's all lined back up again. You can see we have some distortion here, which we can make look a little better by increasing the anti-aliasing quality. And it's going to look like that when you're farther away. Once we get closer, the lines will smooth out. One thing I think I'm going to do is go into the rows and adjust the scale. if this value is 2 and this one is multiplying by 4, that means the output is 8, and we're getting just way too much there. I'm actually going to go ahead and set this down a little lower. -1 to 1 will give us a value of 2, so then we're manipulating this value of 2 from 0 to 4. But what I think I'm going to do is divide it a little, so let's go to 0.5. And that way our rows don't have as big of a scale change, because now we're working with a smaller number. And then there's just one last thing I want to do, and that is to add a little bit of turbulence to the overall clumps. And I'm going to actually just remove the vectors and that variation from each of the nodes here. And we're going to be adding in a small group. And what I need to do is really pay attention to the render output of this, because when you're working with turbulence, you don't always get a good preview in the function editor. So what I want to do is just add a little variation to these lines here that are really quite uniform. Okay, so for this I'm going to do an offset math vector operation offset, connect that to the position. So there. We'll go ahead and connect the parameter, right click, connect. If you're working with an older version of Vue, it'll be kind of like a little lightning symbol. You can click on that and it'll extract it. Extract parameter. And then I'm going to replace that constant with the turbulence. And we should start to see, depending on the scale, offset that a bit. Now right now the material layer that has sort of the path is actually a little easier to see what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these, the offset and the turbulence, go into that grass variation, and we're going to work on that one instead and paste it from there into the other ones, because it is showing a little better. So we'll connect our output to that, input on the position, and now work with the turbulence on that layer. And for this scale, I'm not sure if it's the scale that's making it hard to see, or just the overall amount. It looks like we might be getting a little more turbulence in here now with a higher amplitude. There, that's looking a little better. Go ahead and increase the largest feature, just because we don't want them perfectly straight, just a little bit of jaggedness to them. And I think that should be good. So let's go ahead and just compare 0 and 200. And just kind of look at spots that are straight, and it doesn't look like it's has too much of an impact. I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in. And then we can see the scale maybe a little better. I think I'm going to turn down the bump as well on that Farmland material. Just for now. So going back, the grass variation, and let's take a look at turbulence. I'm going to turn it off. And it looks like maybe 150 and increase the largest feature. Maybe 500 for the largest feature. Wavelength, let's go ahead and increase to 4x5 or 4.5. 250. And you can really just kind of play around with this until you get what you're looking for. Maybe I'll scale that down. Let's see what happens when I bring it down really small. There. Looks like we just had it a little too big. So let's try that. So we'll go ahead and copy this into the other functions, into the other graphs. Just pasting them in. There. There. And also remembering to put the turbulence on there. So that'll match up the bottom one. And now we want the ecosystem to also match. And there we go. And we'll just do a quick render and see how that turned out. And that looks a lot better. So even just that tiny little bit of distortion makes it look a lot better, so we just don't have those super sharp lines that we were having before. Now I did turn down the bump, so you really can't see the rows anymore, so we'd have to increase that to get those rows back, but it really depends on how close you're going to be. There's just one last thing I want to do, and that's add some larger rows as just a color variation and kind of strips to basically act like different types of crops within the same patch. And we're essentially just going to use the same setup that we did for the rows, but make them a little bit larger, and then also not apply it to every section. So we need to make sure it is using somewhat of the same setup. I'll go ahead and just adjust this so we can see it. Now we need to make sure we're controlling the direction and all that the same if we want it to match the other rows. So what I want to do is we can just adjust the output level. And let's see. We're going to create a map node. So filter, map. And I'm going to just go ahead and copy and paste this filter. But this one I'm going to do and make it uniform almost. That spacing about equal. And then we need to modify the scale. This is going to be connected to the map, where, if you remember, because of the clamping range, we have a very high output. Let's see what we can get out of here. What I'm going to do is use this in the color. And let's mix it with this one. Combiner, blender, and then I need a color map. I could just use that black and white one. Connect to there, and we're going to multiply this, and we need to replace input 0 to this one. You can see those showing up, but we want the rows to be bigger, so change the upper output range. And we can change the input to lower that down a little. Actually, increase it. Should give us bigger rows. So let's try 5. Now I don't want this happening all over the place. And right now see if maybe I want to multiply and make it darker areas, or I could do lighter areas, or I could do both. But I don't want it to affect every single patch. So what we need is a ratio controller that we can grab from clumps. And what I want to do, let's see here. So let's just, we'll do, I don't know if we want to do the darker one or the lighter one. We'll bring it down to 0.25 multiply, just give us a little bit of variation. We'll stick with that. And then I only want it to affect certain areas. So we need something from clumps here. So I'm going to add in a filter. And we're going to do the non-offset version. So the top one, we're going to connect our ratio to this filter. Now we're going to get a lot of different ranges from there, so we need to also, we could just cut it out manually. Mostly I'm just using the filter to get this line down here. We could do it, and let's see. First of all, we can go into here and we can just clip 0 to 1, and that way we don't have those lighter areas showing up. But that is kind of, actually, now that I think about it, a neat way to get lighter and darker in the same section without having to do too much. But we don't want to go too high or too low, so we could just edit the filter like this. Now this is still controlling our range and not whether or not it's getting, or whether or not it's affected. So first we'll start with just this mid-range. Actually, that's a good way to go. So this way we get dark and light areas, but we don't necessarily want all of that in there. So to only have some areas with lines, or with the dark or light patches, and some that are just going to be blank, what I'm going to do is just set up another blender. It'll be easier this way. Go to Combiner, Blender. So we'll do input 1 is going to be with lines. Go back to the previous one, which is 0. So some with and some without. And now we just need another clump. And we could use, oh, can't use the filter anymore. So let's just use filter, and let's just use smooth map, or we could use clip. I'm just going to connect that to the clumps, and basically what I want is just a black and white. There's a couple of different ways we could control this, but I'm mostly just going to clip it. Let's do 0, 0.2, or no, 0.5, 0.4, just to give us a black and white, and then 0 and 1 is the output, and now we should have an area and several areas that do not have any of the lines on it, or at least the ones we just added. And that's going to be controlled by the smooth map here. So we can see some of the areas over here don't have those lines if we want. Let's see, one is going to be, so we really want, I think, more gray area. So I'm going to increase this to 0.8, 0.7. So now it's around half. So some with that dark area and light variation, and some without. And I'm going to go back and add a little bit more to that bump. Actually, just a little. And that should be it. I'm going to take a look at a render. And here's the final render. There's a few areas that don't have tree lines that I might want there to be some trees. I could either paint them in, or I could randomize the terrain or the material, try to find a different area. But it's all just kind of tweaking at this point. Because I use the clumps to control where these darker lines are showing, and before I had it set up so that it would lighten some areas, well, basically those light areas are the ones that are being cut out by that same clump that's controlling the ratio. So right now we're just really just seeing the darkened areas, but we have a separate control for that setup now if you want to go back and change it. Really the only thing I would do at this point, just for kind of a quick thing, is one thing about the maple tree is that it's kind of blue for the color. So we can change the overall coloring, make it a little darker green, and get rid of that sort of bluish, and that should look a little better. Otherwise we can go into the material itself for the maple leaf and customize that. But otherwise we can just use the ecosystem. And also if you want to do real crops, you can use the color creator made for the base layer for the farmland color, and just get those patches and use that to control the overall coloring of an ecosystem if you wanted to have rows of plants for if you get closer. You wouldn't want to have actual rows of plants at this scale because it's going to be more geometry than you would probably need. And that's something you'd really just want to limit to a small section. Okay, so that finishes up the farmland material. There's still a few modifiers in here. You customize it. If you remember, we went back and we created a color offset, which is right here. And if you want, it's a good idea to name these. And then what you can also do is give them a color, and that way any of these controls you can go back and customize them. Now we get the different color variation. And if you remember too, we can also go in here and change the line scale. Also remember that since this clumps set of nodes is on 3 different layers, you will have to update them. But if you just want to, in this case we have additional, and actually this one isn't being used at all, but on the other nodes we can go into the alpha for that clumps, and we can make it a little thicker if we wanted for the sort of the roads and the paths in between each of the patches. And then also if we want to increase the ecosystem coverage along those lines. And then of course you can add additional layers if you want to make a forest area, add additional layers that way. So there's still a lot of customizing you can do. But this gives you a nice base to start with. and I hope you found these techniques useful.